All right, let's look at another one of our market-based allocation methods, the constant gross margin NRV method. This particular one, we are going to calculate the revenues for all of the products as a whole, and we're going to subtract out the separable cost and the joint cost, and then calculate a gross margin as a whole for all of the products together. And then we're going to use that gross margin as a target gross margin. And we are going to then make sure that based on our allocation of joint cost across all those products, that the result is that each product has the exact same gross margin. So the constant gross margin percentage NRV allocates joint cost to the joint products produced during the period in such a way that each individual product achieves an identical gross margin percentage. This method works backwards in that the overall gross margin is computed first. And then we allocate the joint cost by calculating them as a residual amount, by subtracting the separable cost and that target gross margin from the actual sales value. Alright, so we've got 3 steps that we have to do in order to calculate constant gross margin. Number 1, we're going to compute the overall gross margin percentage. To do that, we're going to calculate the sales value for everything produced during the period. We're then going to deduct from that all of the joint cost and all of the separable cost in order to calculate a gross margin as a whole. And then that gross margin, we're going to divide that by revenues in order to calculate the gross margin into a percentage. And that percentage, that gross margin percentage, is our target number. We want all of our items to have the same gross margin. Then we're going to compute the total production cost for each product. And then lastly, based on our number, we are going to calculate and compute the allocated joint cost so that each one of those products will have the same gross margin. We're going to be using the exact same information as the scenario we've been looking at all along. We are going to look at it, of course, as the buttercream and the condensed milk being sold, because of course those two are the more involved and they do have the separable costs that are incurred in order to get them to buttercream and get them to condensed milk. So here's our information. Again, we've got step 1. Let's calculate the total sales value or revenues that we would generate if everything we produced during the period were to be sold. All right, so we had 20,000 gallons of the buttercream that was generated. At $25 per gallon, we would have a selling price for that. And then 50,000 gallons of the condensed milk times $22 per gallon selling price, we would have an amount for that. Add those two together. If we sold everything produced, the value of it would be $1.6 million. We then need to add up all of the joint cost plus all of the separable cost. So we had $400,000 in joint cost up to the split off point, plus an additional $280,000 in processing for the buttercream and an additional $520,000 for the condensed milk. Add all that together. $1.2 million is the total amount we would incur in cost and expenses to produce those products. Once we subtract that number, what we have left is the gross margin overall. We've seen this number, 25% $400,000 in gross margin is 25% of 1.6 million. All right, so the way we're going to go about doing the allocation, we want buttercream and condensed milk to both have this 25% as their gross margin. All right, go to step 2. Taking the final sales value for the individual products. Buttercream, if we sold all 20,000 gallons, would be $500,000. And the condensed milk, if we sold all 50,000 gallons of it, would be 1.1 million. We then are going to deduct from that gross margin based on the 25%. So if you take 500,000 and you multiply it times 0.25, then you're going to say gross margin 125,000. For the condensed milk, 1.1 million times 0.25 equals 275,000. Notice that the two of these numbers right here do in fact add up to $400,000 in gross margin. It really does kind of drive me bananas when the publisher or the people generating the books use a number that is also representative of something else. This $400,000 right here, people, is the gross margin. I know that $400,000 is also the same thing as the joint cost in this particular example. Please do not let that throw you off. Okay, once we deduct the gross margin, again, in doing this right here, this is what is going to help us to get to what needs to be allocated, all right? Because this 125 is our target number for gross margin, and this is our 275 is our target number for gross margin for condensed milk. We are then going to subtract from what is left after subtracting that gross margin the separable cost. Okay, so 375 for the buttercream and total production cost is representative of the separable cost, and then how much can be allocated to buttercream in order to make the gross margin be 125. So we're backing our way into it. All right, so 280,000 is our separable cost. If you deduct that from the total production cost of 375, what needs to be allocated to buttercream is 95,000. If we take that total production cost of 825 and subtract the separable cost for condensed milk of 520,000, we get 305,000 in the joint cost to be allocated. So 95 plus 305 does in fact total out our joint cost of $400,000. So we've made it work. All right, so based on this information, we can now move on and do what we've been doing on the income statement part, like in the other examples. Again, we're going to be pulling down the 95,000 in joint cost allocated and the 305 in joint cost allocated and plugging those numbers in. Alright, so we're only going to sell 12,000 gallons of the 20,000 gallons produced of buttercream, so we've still got the 8,000 gallons in ending inventory. Condensed milk, we're only going to still sell 45,000 gallons of the 50,000 gallons that were produced, so that means we've still got 5,000 gallons of it going to ending inventory. So we're calculating cost of goods sold for the income statement and finished goods inventory value for the balance sheet. So here's our revenues for the 12,000 gallons at 25 and the 45,000 gallons at 22. We're then going to subtract all of those production costs. Joint costs being allocated as calculated above, 95 and 305. Their individual separable cost of 280 and 520. If we add those up, it does in fact still match up with what we calculated above. Total production cost of 375 and 825. Of course, you guys know to keep going across and totaling out your numbers over here. We now need to deduct the ending inventory, the finished goods that needs to stay on the books for the balance sheet. If we could calculate our gallons or our cost per gallon by taking the total production cost right here, $375,000 total to produce 20,000 gallons. If you take 375 and divide it by the 20,000, you would get $18.75 per gallon. And if you took the 825,000 and divided that by the total 50,000 gallons produced, you would get $16.50 per gallon. Based on those per gallon, we're going to take 8,000 gallons at $18.75 and say that we have $150,000 worth of buttercream still in inventory and 5,000 gallons at $16.50 for a total of $82,500 left in inventory in condensed milk. Once we subtract those ending inventories from the production cost, we know that our cost of goods sold is the rest of that, $225,000 and $742,500. We can then move forward with revenues minus cost of goods sold equals gross margin. Same over here. Revenues minus cost of goods sold of $742,500 equals $247,500. And then take our gross margin in dollars and divide it by revenues in dollars to give us the gross margin percentage. And lo and behold, they both have 25%. So we have a constant gross margin percentage. Go back and take a look at the other ones that we've done. The gross margin percentage has not necessarily been the same on those others. Alright, so choosing an allocation method. If selling price at split off is available, like I mentioned earlier, the sales value at the split off method is the preferred method, even if further processing is done. Okay, so if we can come up with a selling price at the split off, let's use the sales value at split off method, because it is the best measure of benefits received at that point, at that split off point. It is not taking into consideration any extra processing cost, and it is a common allocation basis. The revenues at the split off point without having major changes in the products, and then of course major changes in selling price per unit. And it is also very simple compared to these other ones that we have taken a look at. If, however, selling prices at the split off point are not available, then we should try to use the NRV or net realizable value method. It is our next best alternative. Under this one that we've just seen, the constant gross margin method, it is the only method of allocating joint cost under which products could actually receive a negative allocation. Alright, so in order to have all of our products receive the same gross margin, if we have got one with some really, really high separable cost, we may have to offset some of those by subtracting from their total production cost in order for them to result with the same amount of gross margin. Alright, so this may be required in order to bring the gross margin percentages of relatively unprofitable products up to the overall average. So keep that in mind.